You're listening to the Life Purpose Advisor podcast, episode 53.
Whatever that kind of emotional swimming pool was that you grew up in, that's where you learn your initial reactions and how you learn to survive and thrive, if you learn to thrive. As an adult, we can go back and have a look at what that stuff is. All of it was useful at one point, and it's just a matter of, is it still useful, or do I need to let go of that story and learn a new story?
You're listening to the Life Purpose Advisor podcast.
Life purpose, spirituality, higher calling, personal growth, meaningful life.
We ask the deep questions about living a balanced life of meaning, purpose, and joy.
Passion, know thyself, be mindful, spiritual practice, aha moments, life lessons, balance.
It is time to welcome your host, Angie Swartz.
Hello, this is Angie Swartz, and welcome to episode 53. I've invited Molly Morrissey to join me for two very special shows this week. You see, Molly Morrissey is a traditional astrologer and a resilience coach, and today, November 2nd, is my birthday. On today's show, we'll be starting with a more traditional interview like you've heard before on the Life Purpose Advisor podcast. I'll be interviewing Molly about her life, her journey, her work, and her life purpose. And tomorrow, on November 3rd, Molly will be illustrating the work she does with astrology using me as her client. Specifically, Molly has taken my birth date, my time of birth, my location of birth, and she'll be using it to do a live astrological reading about me, my innate patterns, and where I'm at in my development. The reason that I asked Molly to do this reading is because I believe all tools teach us to know ourselves better in some way, and they tell us something about our life purpose. I wanted you to hear from my experience what an astrological reading can be like and to see for yourself if this is something that might be helpful to you. You can find all the references that we make on today's show at www.lifepurposeadvisor.com/53. And don't forget to tune in to episode 54 to see what Molly has to tell me and to learn more about astrology. And so here we go for today's episode number 53 with Molly Morrissey. Molly, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
And I am excited and just a little bit nervous about what we're going to do. This is a first for the Life Purpose Advisor podcast.
Well, great. I'm always excited to get out there into uncharted territory.
Well, here we go. So let's talk a little bit about you and your work. So what's keeping you busy these days?
Well, I have lived in San Diego the last 3 years, and I just moved to Taos, New Mexico. So got here about, it's been about 6 weeks now, and so I've been busy getting the house. We bought it. We purchased a home here in Taos. So all of the goodness that goes along with moving house across 2 states. And I'm also have just been in the process of rebranding my business to kind of go along with this big transition. So busy days.
Right, you say to go along with your big transition, so you must feel a big change in your life, a big pull to grow in a different direction?
Yeah, it's probably been about 6 or 7 years now. I've been more and more clear that I wanted to live in a small town, and so and just have a slower pace to my day-to-day life. And so here we are. I'm out of the city.
Right. So tell me a little bit about your work as an astrologer.
Well, it's really woven very closely together with my coaching work. I was actually trained as a psychotherapist and coach about 10 years ago. I finished that training, and during that time, I knew that I would not work in mental health, and it was before there was a lot of life coaches and business coaches out there, so I wasn't quite sure what to call it. The program that I went through trained executive coaches and leadership development people, and so during that program, I became clear that I wanted to fold in something that was a little alternative, and I spent about a year and a half after the program really kind of working through what was I had done a lot of tarot. I had done some shamanic training. I had kind of a lot of different things that I dabbled in. And so I took some time to really get clear what I wanted to fold in. And the traditional astrology I was introduced to at that time, I had dabbled in astrology for years and years as well. And all of a sudden I knew exactly who I was going to get trained by and exactly what I was going to fold in. And so that was in 2007 I made that decision. And so the work I do now is really, I use the traditional astrology. It's a very particular type of astrology, a very old way of doing astrology, to really help people see the complex framework of motivations and behaviors that make them up. We're not just one thing, I think, as we all know. And oftentimes we don't have just one purpose or just one passion. And so the traditional astrology, I think, is a really elegant way of getting some access into the internal dynamic and some of the internal tension that we all experience as we move through our life. And then I mix that in with the coaching, which gives it some behavioral skills and some communication skills to help people really make use of that information they get from the astrology.
Sounds pretty exciting. So for those of us that might not know anything about astrology, can you educate us a little bit about traditional astrology versus what we might be educated to, or maybe what we read in the paper and the astrology readings, or what are the different types of astrology that we might be exposed to?
Well, astrology in general, there's really two families of astrology. One is Western and one is Indian or Vedic. And the difference there is like speaking two different languages. There are two different ways of measuring the sky. And so the Vedic astrologers measure the sky one way, and Western astrologers measure the sky another way. And without getting into the technical side of it, basically the type of astrology that I do uses the beginning of Aries to be the equinox, rather than the Vedic astrologers who use the beginning of Aries, one of the first signs of the zodiac, as being the actual beginning of that constellation up in the sky. So they're kind of two different things. But in terms of what people experience when they're actually talking to an astrologer, then we've got in the Western you've got modern astrology and what's often called traditional astrology. People might call it classical astrology. There's medieval astrology. There's all sorts of different little paths. But really the biggest difference I would say for a client to notice is that the astrology that I do is very quickly gets past the typing system, the signs, Libra, Virgo, Aries, that kind of stuff, and it sort of eschews those generalizations and gets into the specifics pretty quickly. So like as a traditional astrologer, I would never do a moon column. I would never so that's what you see in the newspaper is today's astrology, today's horoscope is if I'm a Virgo, I need to just stay underneath the covers and not walk out the door. And I think as we know, our common sense tells us that, gosh, there's 7.5 billion people on the planet right now and counting, and there are not just 12 ways to live a day. And so I think sometimes modern astrology, and when the modern astrologers are doing their forecasting, they really are so generalized that a lot of times what they say could be true for anybody. And the traditional astrology, that was never the way astrology was used up until about 150 years ago. And so that's one of the big differences is that I'm getting really into your particular inner workings and the kind of the complexities and I always like to call them the tensions that you might experience that would be different from the tensions that your best buddy or your partner might experience. Mm-hmm. Even if you're both Libras, the way that Libra-ness is going to show up is going to be very different. And so I'm not going to be really concerned about you being a Libra as much as I'm going to be talking about how you actually make your decisions or what happens with your temper, things like that. We're going to get really specific.
And that based on the information that you have about place of birth, time of birth, date, versus just knowing that someone is a Libra?
Yeah. So basically, if you think about it, the day of your birth is based on the calendar, and the calendar is based on the movements of the sun. So your sign is actually your sun sign. It's the sign that the sun was in on the day of your birth. And so a birth chart, or it's often also called a natal chart, is a picture of where all of the planets in our solar system were in relation to a horizon and a vertical axis. And so we look at that picture from the position, from the city or the town that you were born in. So kind of from that exact spot on Earth, we get a picture of where the planets were in relation to that exact spot. So like, for example, if you were born at noon on the day you were born, the sun on the chart would be right at the very top, kind of up at what we call the midheaven. And if you were born in the middle of the night, then the sun would be down below the horizon somewhere, if that makes sense. So and then we have a symbol for each of the planets. And as a traditional astrologer, I focus on the 7 planets that we've known about, sun, moon, and then the 5 planets that we've known about. The 3 outer planets in our solar system were only discovered in the last 150 to 200 years, and so I don't really focus on those quite so much.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. The other thing that I find very interesting about you, which we talked when we were doing some pre-discussions about doing these interviews together, is that you come from a background of as you'll see from reading Molly's bio, she has a master's degree. She's a very studious person, very serious in some natures. And you've mentioned to me before that your family is also very educated. And astrology was not such a natural path for you. Is that correct to say that?
Yeah, absolutely. Both my parents are pharmacists, so they're scientists, and they're not hippies. They're not, I would say, and they even both vote pretty conservatively these days. I was brought up in a pretty strict Irish Catholic family, so doing things that were alternative was not so much encouraged in my family. However, I grew up in a very alternative small town in Washington State, Olympia, Washington. And so I kind of got this interesting mix along the way. And I think it allowed me to see that while I was in a family that was pretty traditional and maybe fairly strict, being especially with the Catholic influence, I think being in Olympia kind of allowed me to see that there was a lot of variety in the ways that you could be living your life.
Mm-hmm. So you had the opportunity versus maybe growing up in, let's pick Washington, D.C., a real conservative town, mm-hmm. Versus something that's a little bit more open-minded. You got an influence in there that gave you options to think more openly about what your path might have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that both of my parents did instill in us was that, for better or worse, that we needed to learn how to take care of ourselves. And so we were all encouraged to be pretty self-directed, and if we wanted to go do it, we needed to go figure out how to do it. And my dad, when I got my driver's license, my dad wouldn't let me have the license until I could show him that I could change the oil on my car, that I could, change a tire. So more than just kind of and then my friends had to be able to change the oil on their cars to be able to drive a car when we were in high school. So I think that, they really instilled in us a sense of capable, physically, and also that we could go out and learn about whatever we wanted to go out and learn about.
Self-sufficient, very
Yeah. And I think they try to encourage us to be curious and to kind of learn how to think for ourselves. So, and I think also, of course, then there is the Irish bit where we couldn't sort of help but think for ourselves. And, we're pretty loud, emotional family. So I think that there was certainly some gift there that I got.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I have to ask you this, now that you know what you know about traditional astrology, is there a map that says why you're doing what you're doing today?
From my own chart, I would say there's certainly a very, very strong influence from what in the chart is the ninth house. So the chart is a circle, and it's broken up into 12 pieces of pie, if you will, 6 below the horizon and 6 above. So kind of like a clock, sort of 12 hours. And so if you look at a clock, the hour that we would think of from midnight to 1 on a birth chart would be considered the ninth house. And the ninth house is all about spiritual pursuits and long-distance travel and kind of what's called the Great Pilgrimage, i.e. the Great Pilgrimage back to God, so to speak. And I've got the planet that represents me in my chart is actually up there right on the beginning of that house. And so, yeah, I my whole life I wanted to travel. I wanted to, and that house talks about education. I've always been a very curious person. So yeah, there's a huge influence there from my chart. And then I think the other piece that in my chart really speaks to my love of traditional astrology. Well, two things. Love of traditional astrology. There's Saturn is all things traditional and structure, and he's the Earth planet, very heavy. And I've got a strong Saturn. So there's that. And also the Mercury is a planet of communication, and he is also placed in a very strong position in the chart that kind of would indicate a very sharp intellect. And I think, for better or worse, I'm a smart cookie.
And are all the planets male?
No, we do get to have 2 girls in the group. I think it's traditional astrology is probably didn't quite get the PC memo. So there's 4 guy planets, one that's androgynous that I usually just say he, which is Mercury, although Mercury is very changeable. And Venus and the Moon are they're feminine. They get to be girls.
Mm-hmm. And is that relevant, or that's just
no, it's not really relevant. I think what's relevant is when we talk about feminine and masculine, we're not necessarily talking about boys and girls. We're always talking about characteristics in traditional astrology. We're always looking at going back to these very basic characteristics. And so feminine in my world would relate to the ability to be receptive or inward. Kind of like in the Chinese world, yang, or what am I thinking about here? Yin. The yin is very sort of internal and feminine. And then the masculine is expressive and outward. So that would be more like the yang in the Chinese system. Mm-hmm. So you're just describing something really. It's just kind of an adjective when we talk about feminine and masculine in my work.
Right. Very interesting. Well, I look so forward to learning more as we go along. Thank you for agreeing to do these 2 interviews with me.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to featuring you today and learning more about your life and how you got here. But I have to ask you before we get started, do you think that the kind of work that you do is helpful to someone that is interested in understanding more about themselves and their purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the core of what I do. So,
and why?
Sure. Well, I think it goes back to Socrates, know thyself. And the more we can find different ways of understanding who we are, especially when things aren't going so well, when we're stressed out or we find ourselves with a very full plate. I think a lot of people that are in their 40s and 50s, even 60s, have family and job, maybe an elderly parent that's ill, maybe they're moving, lots of different things going on. And I think in those moments we can kind of get sucked into the busyness of it all. And I think the more that we've done our homework to really understand our own particular patterns, it becomes easier and easier to catch ourselves when we're falling into those sometimes maybe not so helpful patterns. And so I think the more we can get familiar with ourselves, the more we can choose to, choose that optimal behavior that we know we're capable of.
Right. And incorporate a list of tools that we can go to. I talk about this often in my work, like have a list of tools that we know are designed to fit us.
Yeah.
That we can use in those downtimes that we can't quite think clearly enough as we can, as clear as we can on our good days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on our good days, we don't need to know so much because we're out there having a good time and we're maybe in, you talk a lot about flow, we're in our flow. And that's great. And so I think it's really it's the tough times where we kind of need as much help as we can get.
Right. When I believe we're always on our path and everything is in our, for our best growth, but sometimes we kind of have one foot off, and we're slightly balancing on the path and it feels a little uncertain and unsafe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, I completely agree with you. I think you are never off of your path. You're never not living the life you've been given. And it's just that sometimes your emotions or sometimes your conscious self didn't quite get the memo on what was supposed to happen next. And, think about it. If it did, I mean, God, that would be boring.
Right.
I think that is actually the purpose of life, is to learn who you are and to live to the best of your ability the life you were given. I totally agree with all of that. I think all of these tools I think that's what's great about our world right now in the last 10 or 15 years is there's so much out there these days for different types of people, and so we've got a lot of diversity of option, which is awesome.
Yeah, we're going to wake up one way or the other, right?
Yeah, totally.
Wake up to a more conscious life somehow.
Hopefully.
So I'm not even going to say hopefully. I believe it to be true, and I call it as such. So there. So let's dive into your life, Molly. Okay. So do you know? You said earlier in this talk, you said that you believe sometimes there are more than one purpose. But what do you think your purpose is?
I've given this a lot of thought, obviously, over the years. It's been one of those things that I've always been curious about. And I think the thing that I find myself working most often with my clients on, and I think the thing that I find myself most convincing myself of, and most fascinated by for myself is resilience. And that's where I've just rebranded to really focus on that. Because I think that that's ultimately my gift. The gift that I have is I have complete faith in life. Even when it's absolutely challenging and, terrifying and tragic, I still just absolutely think it's a gift. And I think my ability I'm a very practical person, and so I think, which is kind of interesting to say because I'm an astrologer, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily consider astrology to be particularly practical. Although I think I would beg to differ at this point. And I think that I want to help you get through what's going on and remember that it has meaning and it's good. It's all good. Even if it's challenging and if it's bringing you to the core of your self or to the brink of whatever it is that you could possibly imagine being on the brink of, I still think that there's a way to get through. And retain your vitality, I guess, is the crucial thing. So I think that that's my life purpose is to help people learn how to get through, but without kind of white knuckling it, and how to get through without feeling like you're just settling or getting through. I guess so that's really it. It's the resilience piece. That's just what I'm put here to do. I don't see the mundane things as bad. I see them as opportunities.
What an exciting life to be living.
Yeah, my life has, continued to be a gift. And I think I'm one of those people that has always, kind of right out of the gate bit off big chunks. And so I'm not somebody who, I didn't grow up in a wealthy family. I did not have a lot of money. I didn't have a lot of, I would say my family were not big social people, so I didn't have like a lot of connections or family. My family weren't particularly social. So I didn't have a lot of those beginning legs up that a lot of people might have, either money or social connections to kind of help them, people who are ready to mentor them. And I think that's how I know it's possible, because I just went out and just kind of dug in. And I emigrated from the United States when I was just at the end of college. I wanted to get out of the United States. I, at that point, was convinced that it was just an absolutely horrible thing to be an American. And so I left. I left the United States, and I didn't know any other languages because, of course, my pharmacist parents had made me learn Latin, which wasn't going to help me live anywhere but English speaking. So I ended up in England, and I lived there for about 4 years. And eventually came back to the United States and made peace with that. But I think even that initial early adulthood experience was one where I set my mind at it, and I was curious, and I figured out how to make it work. And I had a really good time.
I bet you did, and I bet it was pertinent to where you are now in your life. But what brought you back? Why did you come back to the U.S.?
Well, I didn't actually want to. I was studying architecture at the time, and I had started my master's degree over there in England, so that I could have a visa to stay in that country. And I was kind of slowly. I'd always worked for architects all the way through college, and that's how I kind of put myself through college. And I was getting clear as the years went by that I didn't actually want to be an architect. Because I didn't actually want to put another building on the face of the earth. And so I lost my visa. I had to come home. I didn't have a way to stay in the UK legally. And that was important to me because I had family here that I knew I'd want to come back and visit. So I wasn't willing to stay illegally. So I had to come home. I had kind of exhausted every opportunity, every way that I could think of to stay. And I always assumed I would just get married, like, I would fall in love with somebody and get married and, live the rest of my life in the UK or in Ireland or something like that. And that's just, that wasn't what happened. So, so I packed up my bags and came back.
And do you think that was a hint to where you were going or purposeful thing that happened in your life that was pushing you towards something?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it happened relatively quickly within the first couple of years of being back. Because I quit architecture, and so when I got back, and I'd had a rough experience in the university that I was in England. They were in a process where they didn't really want a whole lot of foreign students, and I was actually the only foreign student that made it through that last year. And so when I got back, I didn't want to go back to school. I'd had kind of a negative school experience. And I wanted to do something with my hands. I wanted to do furniture building, or I'd done a lot of building when I'd been in England, and I loved it. And so I ended up visiting a community college in Seattle where they had cabinet making and furniture building. And they said, the fellow who I was getting a tour from said, well, you should also go see the boat building shop. And I was like, alrighty. And so I walked in that shop, and I knew that moment that was what I was going to do next. Just my whole body lit up. I just the smell of it, the way it looked. I'll never forget that moment. But I knew that I was going to do something to do with boats. And so I said to him, I want to do this, but I don't want to be a student. How can I do this? And he said, well, there's this place. And so he pointed me toward this little wooden boat organization down in Seattle on Lake Union, where they have got a lot of little wooden boats. And I went down there and immediately started volunteering. And it was funny, like when I showed up there, the woman, of course, thought I wanted to volunteer at the front desk. And I said, no, I want to volunteer in the wood shop. And so she said, well, you're going to have to go over and talk to the guy who runs it. And I walked in and I just said, sign me up. How do I do this? This is what I want to do. And he took me through the introduction, and he ended up being a good friend of mine for years and was a huge supporter of me. And I ended up getting a captain's license. It took me a few years, but I worked in the maritime industry for, I guess about 5 or 6 years. So.
And you were a shipbuilder, or what size boats did you build?
Well, so I did kind of the actual woodworking that I did. We ended up figuring out that I was really good at varnishing, what's called bright work. And so I did a little bit of woodworking, little skiffs, like little 15, 20-foot little wooden boats, like little rowboats and little tiny sailboats. I got to help build a couple of those. But mostly I started very quickly doing the finishing work on those boats, and was able to start getting side jobs And all this time I was actually cooking because I had gotten home from England and gotten a job with an architect and hated it and quit after 2 weeks and said I'm not doing architecture anymore. So I started cooking because I had always cooked kind of as a, easy job to travel with. And so I started doing side jobs, vernishing boats, and started volunteering on a couple of the really big, huge wooden schooners that are in the Seattle area. And schooners are kind of those big, traditional-looking sailboats that you've seen pictures of, where they've got all sorts of sails flying everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so through doing that, I was learning how to sail sail little boats, little like 15, 20-foot sailboats on Lake Union in Seattle. And then I was actually getting some sail time trading, either volunteering or actually doing paid jobs on some of the bigger yachts. And getting to trade some varnish work for getting to go sailing with these people. So I was starting to get experience on bigger boats, like, say, 50, 60-foot boats. And then a job came up on a motor vessel, which kind of threw me for a loop. But it was a privately owned yacht, and the fellow was looking for somebody to be the cook and deckhand. And they would be gone for months at a time up in Alaska. And everybody that I knew said, Molly, you've at least got to go to this interview. It's one of the most beautiful boats on the west coast of America. And the guy that runs it is kind of a pain in the ass, but you'll have a really good time, and you'll be able to get your captain's license. And so I went to the interview, and I did not want to be a servant. And that was the other thing, is I had actually interviewed to be a crew person, like to be placed on a yacht. And the woman that I interviewed with had said to me, well, you'll have to be a servant, so you'll just have to get over that. If you're crew on a boat on a yacht, you're considered a servant. And I said to her, I don't think I'm built for that. My little Irish Catholic hackles got raised, and I was like, I'm nobody's servant. And so when this job came up on this boat, and I went to this interview, this old guy that was interviewing me, about the third sentence out of his mouth was, and I would not consider you a servant. I would consider you up here on the boat. And even though you'll be doing all the cooking, I will always wash all the dinner dishes to let you know that I don't consider you a servant. And I was like, done, sold, I'm in. And so I worked for him for about 3.5 years and got my captain's license after that first year. We would be up in Alaska for 4 to 6 months each year and cruised along the Inside Passage through British Columbia and up through Southeast Alaska. And then we would spend our summers over in the Kodiak Island area and the Alaskan Peninsula out in western Alaska. So that was not what I had no idea that was what I was signing up for when I came home from England. But it kind of just happened, and every step of the way I showed up. I showed up paying attention to my intuition. I was always paying attention to the internal signals, and this is a big part of my work with people, is learning how to make your own internal system, learning how to make sense of your anxiety or the joy that you have, or the curiosity especially is a big one. And I all those years I was learning how to do that without even really knowing it, because I was spending a lot of time, especially when we were up in Alaska, running a boat in waters that are sometimes literally uncharted. And waters that would be considered kind of PhD level waters, that are the commercial fishing grounds of the United States. Places where very few people go to do recreational cruising. So we were in some pretty brutal conditions at times. And, you learn how to use all of your observation abilities to take in information through all of your senses. And you've got to think quick on your feet sometimes. So it was really good experience for me to kind of have to learn how to not die, but also how to that I could do it, that I could go on these big adventures and that I was capable. And then I think beyond that, I always used to say to people, I paid as I went along. And this is, I think, the beginning of that resilience work that I was talking about earlier, is that it was tough. The guy that I worked for and I didn't always get along. And there were a lot of times where it was just he and I on the boat for weeks on end, getting the boat from point A to point B before the next chunk of people were going to show up to cruise with us. And it was hard work, you know. I mean, I was down doing work in the engine room. I learned how to change the oil and maintain all the systems in the engine room of that boat. And it was about a 60-foot boat. And so, but it was breathtaking, right? I mean, pristine wilderness. I got to watch all the wildlife, the whales and the bears and the eagles and the birds and otters. And so I always just say to people, I was paying as I went along. I was always very clear that I was not I was not spending my karma, and I wasn't building up karma. I was paying as I went along. And I think that taught me a lot, that, that hard work and that difficulty doesn't mean that you're not, doesn't mean that you don't have satisfaction, and doesn't mean that you don't have bliss. So I think that a lot of times we have this picture, especially right now in our personal growth world, we've got these pictures of people who've got these blissful lives. They travel and they're sitting on the beach with their laptop, and they've kind of got these really idyllic work situations. And I don't know that it's not for me, for sure. And I think for a lot of people, my hunch is that for a lot of people, it's not for them either. And I don't think it happens very often. I think that more likely we find ourselves in situations where we are not ready to give up. There's something that we believe in. Even if our plate is totally full and we are often feeling like we're at the end of our rope, we're not ready to quit. And that's where I think a lot of the lessons I've learned over my professional career, which has been very varied, as you've just heard, has helped me kind of learn how to navigate those waters, so to speak, and help people make sense of the stress they might be feeling, or the internal tension, the internal disagreements that go on. Should I stay or should I go? Do I quit my corporate job, or do I go for the promotion? Do I stay in this marriage, or do I leave it? These are big questions, and I think sometimes the popular literature can encourage us to throw it all away for this elusive bliss. And I think my work helps people kind of make a little bit more grounded decision and kind of path forward.
I'm sure that's true. Can you take us from the connection from this wonderful, what must have been amazing work that you did in Alaska on a ship as a captain and a cook, to astrology? Is there a direct path that you can connect the dots between those things?
Yeah, I always tell people that the short version of that is, so I did architecture, studied as an architect, which is symbols of a building on a piece of paper, and those symbols on the paper describe space. And then I was a boat captain and a first mate, and I was working with symbols on a piece of paper that are a picture of the ocean that help you how to move through that space, navigate the ocean, navigate and travel safely, hopefully. And then astrology then is a set of symbols on a piece of paper that describes people, or describes events, or describes patterns, exactly. So there's a pattern thing that was happening all these years. And also I was still doing a lot of traveling. So from my time in England to my time in the maritime industry, I was just always traveling. And I loved meeting all the people that I met. I got to come across a lot of different types of people, from crusty old fishermen to really slick London architects. I loved hearing people's stories. I loved hearing about how people got from point A to point B. And I always found it really fascinating because there was always something that went on in people's early part of their story that made me kind of always say, oh, not surprising then that you ended up where you ended up. How cool. And there were times where I would say that, and they would be like, oh, I never thought about it like that before. And so, while I was in my first mate boat captain job, I knew that wasn't going to go on for long, and I knew that I wanted to go back to school. And I figured out it had something to do with communication because I loved talking to people. And I loved hearing their stories. So I eventually gave notice on the Blue Whale. And I gave a year's notice and said after the next year I'll be done. And helped him sell the boat eventually. And then I didn't know. I didn't know what I was going to do, what to do with communications. And so for the first time in my life, I actually didn't know what was going to happen next. And I went to see a counselor. And she really quickly, the questions she was asking me, I had no idea how intuitive I was. I'd never known intuitive people, and I didn't really know that was a thing. So she really quickly was pointing out to me how intuitive I was. And I loved.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you,
yeah.
Molly, but how old were you at this point?
I was 30. Let's see here. I was 32.
Okay.
So all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I want to do what she's doing. That's because I was thinking communication. Well, teaching, probably something to do with teaching. God, am I going to be a high school math teacher? And I was like, no, that can't be it. And so all of a sudden I'm talking to this counselor. Again, this is before life coaches. So she was just, a counselor, like a psychotherapist. And I was just sitting there going, oh my God, I love how she's making me think about myself. I'd never done, I'd done a lot of yoga at that point. And so that was my only reference for sort of self-analyzing was yoga and like the chakra system, which is pretty esoteric. And so she kind of opened up this whole world for me of understanding. I thought at that point, oh, psychotherapy is kind of for crazy people. And I had a friend kind of go, no, Molly, it's for people who were just confused. And I was like, okay, well, I'm definitely confused. So it was awesome. And that was, very quickly I was signed up into a master's program. And it was then that I started to kind of go, okay, well, maybe I can do like energy work or, something to do with the chakras because that's what I knew. And then I think my natural inclination to want to have solid logic and reasoning behind me, kind of over and over again kind of took over. And while I loved doing the energy work and the shamanic work, for me personally, it was a little too loosey-goosey.
And how did you learn about shamanic work and the chakra system?
Well, the chakra stuff was really, I had done yoga. I had a good friend of mine who was a yoga teacher who I knew in Seattle, and she kind of, this was like when I first got back from England, before I was really doing a lot of work on the boat. She got me to go to a yoga class one day. So this was probably 1998. She got to go to, or maybe 99. She got me to go to a yoga class, and I loved it. I didn't have a car at that time, so I was riding my bike all over Seattle. Having my panniers on my bike with all my varnish gear. You can imagine me getting on the ferry to go to Bainbridge Island to work on somebody's boat.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was in pretty good shape, and she was like, oh my God, you'd love yoga. Just come to a class. And so I did, and I loved it. So, of course, I like to study and research. So I started reading about yoga and somehow came across a book that had to do with the chakra system. And, it was just fascinating to me because, again, that was my first tool, my first kind of introduction into kind of the self-awareness and looking at your interior and starting to understand your own kind of internal patterns. So I was hooked. And I had always done tarot, but that to me seemed totally different because that was like to help me figure out what I wanted to do next. What I wasn't necessarily giving me in like self-awareness.
And when you say you'd always done tarot, like from what age?
Let's see, probably college. I had always, so again, this goes back to the parents making me take Latin. Of course, when you take Latin, you get to know all the mythology, which I loved. Loved hearing all the stories, loved hearing about the gods and the goddesses and the Greek and the Roman and all that. And I loved, I always say to people, God, I hate this. This is going to make me be exactly in my age group, but one of my formative experiences was Star Wars. Star Wars was released when I was about 7 years old. And so I was just the perfect age for that mythic, epic journey to just really light me on fire. And so that storytelling piece was always, that was the magic for me. Like, I loved stories. And my dad would, we had a big, like, old Hans Christian Andersen book that was kind of like an old-fashioned book with beautiful drawings. And he, you know, at nighttime he would, like, read to us from that. I don't know if he did that for my younger siblings because you know how that happens. But since I was one of the older kids, I got to have these stories read to me. And, you know, I loved all of that. So I think when I was in college, again, I somehow got, I don't even remember how I got exposed to tarot cards. And to me, it just made sense. It was like, oh, here's all the mythology. You know, you've got the Fool, and, you know, he's going on this journey, and it's just like the Odyssey. Or it's just like, you know, it's just like anything that Homer wrote. And so I just kind of, to me, it seemed like the same thing. And I think, again, here we go, like, I loved symbols. It was always really easy for me to see the theme or to take a symbol and translate that across applications. So I could take what I'd learned in high school Latin class and the cards, the tarot cards that I started messing around with in college, like, they just made sense to me. But I wasn't necessarily thinking about myself. Like, I wasn't, you know, I didn't feel like, I don't know that I was learning about my own internal, I wasn't consciously learning about my own internal patterns as much as I felt like I was learning about how life works.
I love all these points that you're making, that you didn't really know that you were learning about yourself, that all of these things have been showing up for you since age 7, even though you weren't connecting the dots. I think for those of you listening, the same thing is happening to you,
yes.
Even if you can't see it, even if you're feeling frustrated that you don't know what your purpose is, it's happening now. Even as you're listening, it's happening right now.
Yeah.
So for you, Molly, it sounds like there's been a very clear path, even though, same thing, you couldn't see it as well. So you've been doing all of these different things that led you to where you are today. I think your career in studying architecture and being a ship captain, very interesting, but I'm kind of lit up a little bit by what you're talking about with the Latin and tarot, and where there's a very clear path as to how you got where you were today.
Well, and it didn't make sense, though, to me at the time, and so this is where when I got done working on the Blue Whale, and I'm sitting there in that counselor's office crying, because I'm like, it's so shameful for me to not know what's supposed to happen next. Like, I had always been so self-directed and so strongly minded, and even though it kept changing, I guess that was starting to wear on me. I was starting to kind of feel like, lost. Yeah, and I could intuitively feel like it all hooked up, but my brain I couldn't see it. And I think a lot of people, so many people in our culture, feel lost, and they don't know how to see that thread. I mean, being able to say the thing about the symbols from architecture to maritime to astrology, I was only able to say that a few years ago. And when that occurred to me, that was, again, one of those aha moments of like, oh, you know, I've always known somehow it would all hook up together, but I could never see it. And I just think it's a really common experience. Yeah.
Yeah, very common, very. And just for the sake of those out there listening, I don't want to ask your age, but approximately how long ago was that when you were sitting in the counselor's office?
That was about I'm in my mid-40s, so it was a little over a dozen years ago.
And from that point in time, when you were sitting in her office learning that this is really cool, I'm very intuitive, to the time that, and then you went to school, to the time that you started practicing with astrology, how long was that period of time?
That took about, I opened my business when I was, so I started working as a practitioner, and again, I even read tarot cards for people a little bit in 2007. I kind of pretty quickly realized I wasn't ready, and then I really opened my business again, even though I was sort of seeing clients here and there during that time. I opened it again. I kind of reopened it with the astrology in 2009. And so that was the first time that I was saying I'm a professional astrologer and I'm a coach. I'd been saying I was a coach since I had started in 2007, but I wasn't, like, the astrology didn't really show up fully formed for me until, and so during that time, I would say from especially during all of '08 was when I found my astrology teacher. And from that moment, the minute I first read an article of his, I knew that he was going to be my teacher. It just was the first time that it was one of those, like, this is it. This is absolutely it. And so that was about 1.5 years until I actually launched as a professional astrologer. But I was voracious during that 1.5 years.
And what do you mean by that, voracious? Just give us a little look into that.
I mean, I had left Seattle for 1 year and was living up in one of the small, and this is when I got the small town thing into me. I went and lived up in Port Townsend, Washington. It's a boat community, a wooden boat community up in the Olympic Peninsula. And so I was, back to refinishing boats, doing a little bit of kind of, tarot or coaching stuff on the side for people here and there. Had been doing some work with a gal who was a local astrologer, modern astrologer, and her stuff didn't really resonate because there were things about it that didn't make any sense to me, and I couldn't get a straight answer. But I was already reading. I mean, she was letting me borrow books, just like literally every day when I got back from whatever boat work I had to do to pay my bills, like reading, and I got the astrology software that I now have. I bought that at that point and just starting to work on charts. And I kind of had dabbled in astrology over the years, so I had like already a rough idea in my mind, but all of a sudden, and especially when I started getting into his stuff, I probably had all of his stuff that I could get my hands on, all of his books read within the first 2 or 3 months after I heard about him. And then just rereading them and trying to understand, make it all make sense in my head. And doing my own charts and like a lot of the traditional work, there's the kind of the core rung of astrology has to do with just asking questions. So, like, for example, where did I leave my scarf? Or when will the package arrive? Or is this relationship very good for me? Or, just kind of really questions about anything. And getting correct answers out of charts, is spectacular.
So you can help someone find their car keys based on...
You sure as hell can.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've predicted the exact day of children's births. I mean, I'm not going to say that I do that there is incredibly accurate prediction available with traditional astrology. It's spectacular.
Sounds like it. And folks, what we're going to hear from Molly about my patterns tomorrow.
I don't know that we're necessarily going to get into that stuff tomorrow, but it's kind of its own like little section. But yeah, you never know. There is a couple of things in your intake that you filled out that I will potentially do a question chart on. So we'll see.
Wow.
And it's never infallible. I always tell people it's just like life. There's no guarantee. So don't ever think that an astrologer is going to tell you exactly what's going to happen.
Because we're at cause, right? We make our own choices.
Well, because we don't have all the answers. And, and I actually would say from my spiritual belief, I do believe in God. I don't care if you call it, what you call it, higher power, source. He, she, it. I say to clients a lot, he, she, it. But I do believe in a higher power. And the higher power knows what we're going to do because they're living outside of time.
Mm-hmm.
So they're seeing all of it at once. And it's almighty. The God is almighty. They can change it up at will. So even though there's a system there that's pretty amazing, and that would kind of ruin the game to be able to always, there's no point in life if there's a guarantee.
If we could see all the blueprints, that wouldn't be so fun anymore.
No. So I think what we have is pretty amazing. I think what we're able to do with it is pretty spectacular. But as long as people understand that, we do. We have free will. We have to choose how we're going to work with what we have.
Good. How exciting.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
It does. So you believe in God. You have used all these amazing tools over the year and had all this great travel adventure. You're naturally curious. Do you ever feel like we agreed that we're never off the path, but do you ever feel like you get slightly out of sync, and what practices do you use?
Absolutely. I'm just a little human sitting here living my life. I do think that that's universal. I think anybody that says that they never that they never feel discombobulated is smoking something.
They would be God, right?
Yeah, and it's just not going to happen. I would be very skeptical. And so for myself, I think it's all the things we've talked about in terms of, I do believe in God. I do believe that that there is a life that I was given, and it's unfolding before me. And it's my work to keep my chin abreast of the water. It's my work to stay engaged and I'm in charge of making sure I keep my vitality and my soul and my spirit alive. So I have to make the hard choices at times about how to do that best, and that shifts from day to day. So I've learned, I kind of am one of those people that's got a pretty temperamental physical system. So sometimes there's certain foods I can eat and sometimes I can't. And I get outside most days, and whether it's walking or running or a little bit on my bike, I've got to do that. So there's the physical upkeep, and that's a huge pattern just because otherwise I'm sick. I'm not one of those people that's got my partner, he has got an incredibly resilient physical body, and he can just do whatever he wants, and he just he just moves right through it. And I'm always like, wow, that's not my experience. So yeah, there's a lot of little things I do over a week. But I think the psychological stuff is that belief that I can use my brain and I can research and I can take responsibility for understanding as much as I can. And then I have to learn how to give it up. So I'm always looking for that moment where that's not something I can actually know. That's something I have to learn how to trust. And to me, faith is not necessarily like saying I believe in Buddha or I believe in Jesus Christ or I believe in, Allah. But to me, faith is a daily practice of learning how and when to risk. So I think it's, in those moments when I feel like crap, how am I going to collect myself enough to feel the vitality that I've been given as a gift and get back to work, knowing that the ambiguity might continue for a little longer.
And are you able to step outside yourself and say, oh, ambiguity, you're here again. This is what's up.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, here you are again. And I think we all do that. Oh, God, this feels familiar. And to me, I'm like, okay, good. Well, and I'll sometimes say, okay, what feels familiar? Is it good familiar or bad familiar? And again, I've done a lot of work to understand my family of origin patterns. So at this point,
and what do you mean by that?
So I'm trained in family systems theory. And what that means is that there's a belief that all things are connected, and that the way that shows up in human beings is that we are a product of our context. So of course we've got DNA, but just as much as we have a DNA, we also have, it's the nature versus nurture, right? So all the emotional responses that we learn and that we're able to do, we actually learn by about the age of 7 or 8. And we learn them from our culture of origin, our family of origin, the socioeconomics, status that we were born into. And so it's not necessarily your mom and dad. I mean, maybe you didn't grow up with your mom and dad. But it's whoever the people were that were around you, whatever that kind of emotional swimming pool was that you grew up in, that's where you learn your initial reactions and how you learn to survive and thrive, if you learn to thrive. And as an adult, we can go back and have a look at what that stuff is, and some of it, all of it was useful at one point. And it's just a matter of, is it still useful, or do I need to let go of that story and learn a new story? And so you can't, I think, often change those stories until you can see what they are in the first place. And so family of origin work is really about being able to spot your patterns again. Here we are back to patterns. And especially when we're stressed out and things are moving, especially like, say, when stuff's going really fast. Something's going at work and there's a lot of pressure to keep going and you don't have time to think. I mean, sometimes there's a few Sometimes there's a couple of weeks go by and I haven't been outside because stuff is happening so fast. And it's in those moments that it's so crucial for us to be able to see what our patterns are. And I think that just comes with practice. So that's, again, I'm a huge believer in understanding the patterns, because then we can be more choiceful about them. I mean, my mom's been sick this last year, and I started off the year, okay, here we are, great, I'm going to be with my family a lot this year. And I'm still sane. I've had a good time. I'm closer with a couple of my siblings than I ever have been. And I would attribute that in large portion to the fact that of this family systems work that I have access to. Even though it's been incredibly stressful at times, I think I've been able to, for myself to see when I was falling into old patterns, and had to kind of have been able to allow myself the discipline to sort of say, I just can't do that. And then to be able to be surprised by other family members showing up, and the dynamic actually changing in real time. It's pretty, I think it's a gift. And it doesn't always have that happy ending, but yeah, I mean, over the last 10 years, I've been over and over again thankful for the work that I learned how to do when I was in grad school. So
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing
it's
to
really
look
cool.
at your life. I just want to go back for a minute to, or a few minutes. You were talking about your belief in God, and a lot of this that you're talking about is an illustration of your faith as well, or at least it seems to me. Did you always grow up with such a strong faith? You mentioned that your family was Catholic, or did that come later in your life?
I think, well, when I was a kid, I figured out, I was like, oh my God, these people actually believe this story is actually true. Oh my God, they're crazy. So, yeah, because I'm a skeptic by nature. So, no, I'm a skeptic by nature. I'm a skeptic. And so you need to show me. And so what I got shown was I had family members who I always say were Catholic in the right way. My grandmother said the rosary every day. She went to Mass. She was a generous, kind-hearted, delightful human being. And as an adult, I can see that that's partly because of her faith. And so I think I have come back to, I don't know, I'm not a Catholic, but I've come back to, I think, some of the tenets of the family that I grew up in terms of that daily faith, that optimism, that life's worth living, even in the midst of challenge. And so that piece, even though I don't know that I got that from being Catholic, I would say that it did come from that Irish Catholic family of origin. I loved when I lived in Liverpool, England. I loved living there. It's an Irish city, and it was the first time in my life I'd actually been around real Irish people. I'm American Irish, so I'm just American. And for the first time in my life, I actually home, and it was a big lesson for me to understand. I love English people, but I also love Irish people, and to learn the difference and to learn my heritage. What that actually meant to be. Whenever I went over to Ireland, I would be standing in these tiny small towns, and people would walk up to me and ask me where the bakery was. And I'd be like, I'm American, I'm not from here. But it was wacky to look like everybody that was for the locals. And I think that that brought me back to this, again, maybe the magical piece of being Irish, where a friend of mine who's Irish used to he'd be like, oh yeah, we're just the Irish berserkers. And we're up to, no good shenanigans. And there is something that's a little off the beaten path of being Irish. And I think I was taught, I think that piece of life being unpredictable is also something that I got from my family. And I think as I've come back to my own spiritual beliefs, as they've kind of solidified over the last, I would say 4 or 5 years, I would say my spiritual belief, I would say if we had another hour, I could very clearly tell you what I think about the world. in terms of the spiritual element of how life works. And I think I've only been able to do that in the last few years. And I think that faith, of course that's for my family, because they were all very faithful people.
And why is that back for you? Like, what's the switch that flipped?
Gosh, this is going to sound really weird, but I think just I got to be a certain age. I think I just had enough life. I was very idealistic when I was in my heck, I tried to emigrate out of the United States when I was in my early 20s. I was very idealistic. Mm-hmm. And I think I've had enough life now under my belt, even if I'm only in my mid-40s, that, God, shit happens, Like, life is tragic. Life is also incredibly beautiful. And I just think over and over again, I've had the option of choosing to see the beauty over, like, I'm a total realist, right? Like, I'm the person who wants to get into the nitty-gritty details of what's shitty right now. But it's in service of being able to be thankful. So that's one of my other daily things, is I've got a pretty strong gratitude practice. To be thankful every moment for how spectacular life is. And so that's where, I can go back and dip into my library of memories if I need to.
And is your gratitude practice something that's written? Or
No, it's like, so when I mostly do it when I go outside and walk, but if I am not like the last couple of days, I actually haven't been outside and walked. And so I'll catch
because you have tarantulas where you live now, right?
Oh my God, yeah, there was a tarantula in my backyard last week. Oh my God, yes. I knew I had a sense that there was. I've lived in New Mexico before, and there was a tarantula here the other time, so I figured there probably would be, but I was hoping maybe not in my neighborhood.
But I was just teasing you a little bit. Going back to what you were saying about your gratitude practice.
So I think so what I do though is, and this is where if I can catch myself when I'm having a tough time, like right now I've been doing a lot of copywriting for my website, and writing is not something that comes easily for me. I tend to get really critical. I get into all my worst patterns when I'm trying to write. And so I have to be diligent, to go, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And one of the first things that always comes into mind when I ask myself, why are you doing this, is because I have the opportunity to. I'm grateful that I have been given a life where I'm able to build this work that I believe in and have an opportunity to do. I have time to write. To do the writing and to procrastinate, So I just sit there and go, okay, why are you doing this? Because I can, and then that immediately makes me be. And I have a lot of art in my house, so every time I look up, I see something that's beautiful, and that's by design, so that I just am reminded of why I'm doing the hard stuff. So that's kind of that's my day-to-day thing, is I just have got to have a lot of reminders, and I've been very careful to craft a life where I have something beautiful to remind me.
I want to ask you a lightning round of short yes or no, short answer questions, but before we get there, I want to ask you about money, if you don't mind. So are you happy with the amount of money you're able to make with your current practice? Does it matter? Of course. Yeah, of course it matters. It has come up and down. It has, there have been times when I've been really happy with it. I'm actually not so happy with it right now. Again, I've had a very ill mother this year, and so I've had a lot of time off, up taking care of my mom. So, that's had an impact. I'm kind of in the process of getting back to where I was at. So it fluctuates. Does that cause me stress? Of course. Do I exit the stress best I'm able? Yes. But you still do the work.
Yes. And does it stop me from taking big risks? No. So I just moved to Taos, I'm not going to my guys still going to be in San Diego for a while, for a year or two, and we're going to kind of be going back and forth. And that's a big risk. And I'm kind of like, I don't have a ton of extra cash right now. Oh, well, it'll work out.
Well, that happens sometimes when you buy your dream house. And
Totally. And I mean, and that's, to me, that's the lesson. The money thing has never stopped me. I have traveled all over the place. Like I said, I've been in uncharted waters. And the money thing has been there and not been there. And it's momentary stress that, I got to pay my bills.
Works out.
It works out. It works out one way or the other, right?
Good. Thank you for that. It does. So far, you're proof that it does.
Yeah, and I don't do a lot of extra stuff, right? So I'm not one of those people who's a shopaholic. So that's, I guess, the other thing that I would say is I don't spend money like probably a lot of people do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So moving on to the lightning round, do you think passion and purpose are the same things?
No.
Do you think everybody has a life purpose?
Yes.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, how important is following your joy and igniting your life purpose?
I would say probably a 6, kind of middle.
Okay. Did you ever quit your job to follow your purpose, and do you think somebody needs to quit their job?
Yes, I have once or twice quit a job to follow a purpose, and I don't think it's necessarily necessary. Okay.
What brings you great joy?
Beautiful things in life, people.
If you unexpectedly amassed a good-sized fortune, what would you do differently?
That was a good question. I saw that one in the thing. I don't know that I would do anything differently other than I would hire a goddamn writing coach.
She says emphatically.
Because like I said, writing is really hard for me. And, I'm doing what I need to do. I mean, that answer would be same throughout my whole life. I've always done what I needed to be doing.
Okay. And so in getting ready to close, what should listeners learn from your life?
That if you want to do it, you'll figure it out. But you have to be willing to follow your curiosity. You've got to stay in touch with your curiosity. And that's what you can learn from my life is I think hard work is not a bad thing. Messiness is not a deterrent. And curiosity is, that would be my 10 on the what do you need to find your purpose? Curiosity. Way over joy, in my opinion.
I see. So what do you need to be curious about quickly?
You need to pay attention to what you already are curious about. You don't have to be curious. You don't make yourself curious. You already are curious. You have to be willing to slow down long enough to figure out where your curiosity is living.
I couldn't agree more. And so for someone that's been listening to us and the curiosity is already sparked in them, do you have any recommendations for what step they could take next?
Well, if they have taken some time, yes, to pay attention to that curiosity, do some research. Whatever that is, how can that curiosity show up as something physical? If it's a book or an experience or a person or a thing, start researching. Go check out books from the library. Go feed it. Feed the curiosity.
So, for example, if someone was listening to you today and they said, oh, man, I always really wanted to be a cook and a mate on a ship in Alaska. I've wanted to do that my whole life. You're recommending that they go find out how to learn more about that experience.
Yeah, and there's books, there's seafaring stories. There are, there's maritime towns all up and down both coasts. So you can actually go find places if you Google a little bit. Heck, if you were really curious, you could email me. If it was the West Coast, I would definitely be able to give some places to go check out. I might know some places in Europe, and I might know some places in the Northeast as well that I could point you toward. But yeah, again, there's so many different places where you could start. And again, what are you curious about? Are you curious about sailing, about boats, about metal boats or big motor boats, going fast, going slow, cruising, being on an open ocean, being anchored up in a little cove. So start to pay attention to what it is you're actually curious about, articulate it.
What is brewing inside you that wants to be ignited? So tell us, what is the best way for people to connect with you?
I am just starting to blog again, speaking of writing. I've been a little dormant this year. So on my website, mollymorrissey.com, there's a blog. And, again, I haven't really been super active on my Facebook page either, but I used to be, and I will be again. Drop me an email. That's probably the best way if you have a particular question. I love emailing. I'm happy to write a response back. Molly@mollymorrissey.com is my email address.
Right. And if someone wants to know more about your work as an astrologer and the work that you do as a coach, can someone work with you? Can I talk you into tossing out an offer?
Yes, of course you can. There's plenty of information on my website at mollymorrissey.com about the work I do.
Which we know you cussed through writing, so we'll go read that.
Exactly. And so, yes, the one session work that I do is a birth chart consult, and I'm happy to give the first 5 people that listen to this 20% off. I won't have a particular promo code on the website. Just send me an email. If you're curious to have the birth chart session done, send me an email at mollymorrissey.com and mention this podcast, Life Purpose Advisor, or just mention Angie, and I'll be happy I can just send you a PayPal invoice and we can get going.
That's very exciting. Thank you for that offer. So 20% off to the first 5 people that get in touch with Molly. And don't forget that you can listen tomorrow to episode 54, where she's going to do an example, at least partly, of some of the reading or the analysis that she does with her astrological work. I'm getting a little tongue-tied here, Molly. So why don't you tell folks what you're going to do with my information tomorrow?
Well, like I do with all my clients, I have an intake process. People get to listen to an audio, and then they've got a questionnaire that they fill out through Google Docs. And so Angie has already gone through that process, and so I've got a whole bunch of information about her background and what she's done in the past and kind of how she feels like she operates. And I've asked her questions about her strengths and her weaknesses, things that she feels like are challenges, and also a little bit about where she's at right now and what she's concerned about or what she'd like to kind of get a little bit more insight on. So that's what we're going to do tomorrow. We're going to talk about her basic patterns that show up astrologically in her natal chart, and then we're going to really just get into a conversation about how she's managing the challenges that she has right now. And she's kind of chosen one more professionally oriented thing to talk about. So knowing that this is going to be a public conversation, we're going to be conscious of the fact that maybe there would be things that we might normally talk about if it was private. So we will kind of walk that fine line. And hopefully Angie will walk away with some insight, as well as some next steps for her to follow up on as she manages the stuff that we're going to talk about.
What a great description. And hopefully anyone that listens will walk away with some ideas about what you would be able to do for them and what astrology can bring into their lives. So I thank you, Molly, for joining me with this two special editions of the Life Purpose Advisor podcast. Is there anything else that you want to say or anything we didn't get to today?
I think I just talked you out. I think we did it. Again, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to, and even the smallest question, I'm happy to answer those via email at mollymorrissey.com.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Molly. I will speak to you tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Angie.
My pleasure. My pleasure. You've been listening to episode 53 of the Life Purpose Advisor podcast, our special edition on my birthday, 11/2, and with my special guest, Molly Morrissey. If you'd like more information about working with me, about finding your life purpose, just contact me at Angie@lifepurposeadvisor.com. You can also sign up for our self-study at lifepurposeadvisor.com, and we will see you next time.